Good morning. Today we're going to be doing the graph of the cosine. This all centers around our unit circle again. So what we're going to start with is reviewing what the sine graph looks like. So the parent graph of the sine graph, one of the things we need to know is that we have to get our scale on there. This goes from -1 to +1. So this is where y equals 0. And the scale, as we go along here, we're going to go by pi over 2, or by half pi. So 1/2 pi, 2 halves, so that's pi, 3 halves pi, so 2 pi over 3, 2 pi, that's our full circle. If this were to continue, that would be 5 pi over 2 and 3 pi. But we're only going to graph the one period. The sine graph, if you guys remember, we were going from our unit circle. That's really poorly done, and we were traveling around this way. So this right here indicates how far around the circle we've gone. 2 pi is one full circle, and what we were finding with the sine graph was all of our vertical distances. So anything down here was negative. So we were finding all of those. So when we start here on our circle, we're at 0, 0 because we haven't traveled any distance around the circle, and we're at an altitude of 0. At pi over 2, we have an altitude of 1. At pi, we have an altitude of 0 again. As we continue around at 3 pi over 2, we are now at an altitude of -1. And full circle at 2 pi, we're back at an altitude of 0. So our sine graph starts at the midline, goes up, goes back to the midline, down to the minimum, and back to the midline. This would continue to go on and on and on in both directions, but that is one period or one cycle of the sine graph. So what we're doing today is the cosine graph. The cosine graph is looking for a different distance, and we'll talk about that. So this is back to the circle of terror ride that goes a kilometer above and a kilometer below, and now the premise of this, which is a little bit silly, is now the horizontal distance to what they call in the story problem the golden pole. So as you're going around, somebody was measuring how far you are from that center. So the reason this ends up being the cosine graph, if I, draw a triangle in here, there's my right triangle. This is 1. Let's say this is the 45 degrees. So cosine is adjacent over hypotenuse. So since we're looking for this distance right here, the adjacent over the hypotenuse, which is 1, then we're finding the cosine at that particular value. So all these horizontal distances as opposed to vertical distances that it was with the sine graph. So what that ends up looking like, let me move this down and go ahead and add in a unit circle there. So as we travel around, starting at 0, 0, so no distance traveled around, we are 1 unit away from that center line, 1 horizontal unit. So instead of starting at 0, 0, we start at 0, 1. So the blue on here, that's our sine graph, if you hadn't figured that out yet. So then as we travel around the circle to pi over 2, we are 0 away from our center line. So we continue further around. At pi, we are now -1 from our center line because we're the direction to the left. And then as we continue further to 3 pi over 2, again, we're on that center line, so we are at 0. And then at 2 pi, we're back at 0, back at 1, 0. So we're a distance of 1 away from that center line. So the sine graph the cosine graph looks like that. And as you can imagine, you would continue to go in that same, starting up, go to the middle, go down, middle, up. So it would continue the same way in both directions. And so we have something that looks an awful lot like the sine graph. But if we're looking at that single period, make that a little bit bigger. So if we cut it off here and we cut it off at 2 pi, at one parent graph period, the sine graph starts at 0, 0, goes up, middle, down, middle. Cosine graph starts up, goes middle, down, middle, up. They're basically translations of each other. That's really about it. I'm going to show you really quickly what I will require for a single, sorry, words are not coming to me very well. What I'll require on your test for one period, because we're going to be doing transformations of these. So what you need to make sure to have on here is a scale. We're going up to 1, down to -1. We go by pi over 2. You need to make sure to put that on there. And 2 pi. This would be negative pi over 2. We're not going anywhere to the negatives in this direction, but it's good to know. And then when we actually graph it, the points that are required are the, whoops, that's the wrong place for the cosine graph, are the first point up, middle, down, middle, and up again. So that is a single period of the cosine graph. Next class, we're going to get into translations and movements and flips, reflections, I should say. So we're going to get into transformations of that using that AHK that we used in our parent graph unit and have used several times since. So those clearly marked points are the ones you really need to have on there, as well as the general shape. So that's it for the cosine graph. Hope you have a great day.